Greenleaf and the Black Blade, a serialized adventure podcast by Andrew Israelsen. The night passed without incident. Nima and Bruckner took turns keeping watch, while little Tadalak slept like a stone, with only a small whirring snore to indicate his presence. Tadalak awoke several hours before dawn, and patting Bruckner sleepily on the head, said,
"We'll take a few more hours' rest, Ox. I must do some reading. Spell work is a tricky business after all. I'll have breakfast for you and little sister just after sunup."
Nodding gratefully, Bruckner lay back down, setting his shield and sword near to hand. As Bruckner slipped back into sleep, he watched as Tadalak walked a short distance away, lit a lantern, set the lantern on his head, and pulled out a huge book that he began poring through. Sometime later, Bruckner awoke with the sun warm on his face. He rose, stretched, performed his necessaries, and strolled over to the fire. Nima was awake, sitting in silence and sharpening her dagger. She had already packed. Tadalak was tending to the flames.
"Fancy some coffee, Ox?"
Tadalak asked, smiling widely as Bruckner approached.
"Nima said she hasn't had a decent cuppa for nearly a month."
Without waiting for a response, Tadalak reached a hand into the small pouch on his belt and pulled out a fair-sized metal cauldron that quite obviously could not have fit into any mere material bag of that size. He hefted the pot onto the fire, then muttered a few words, reaching his hand out. A jet of water began to flow into the cauldron, coaxed into being through Tadalak's sorcery. Once the water was boiling, he produced a burlap sack full of coffee. Soon Tadalak had finished and was pouring it into 3 mugs he pulled from his sack.
"You're more and more useful all the time,"
Bruckner said, taking the steaming cup. Nima accepted hers with a smile and a nod, savoring the drink in small, long sips. As he drank his coffee, Bruckner polished his sword and lightly kissed the edge with the rasp of his whetstone. Satisfied, Bruckner began donning his armor.
"When one is on the hoof all the time, one learns to bring along some of the comforts of home. These 3 years of adventuring have given Tadalak time to acquire some useful toys."
He patted his little satchel and said,
"You see this bag? It can hold anything. Well, almost anything. And whatever I want just pops right to the top when I reach in. I won it in a card game in Beridia last year from a mendicant preacher of Thum named Kerbeck Danderstein. Apparently the bag was ensorcelled by no less a mage than Finlian the Paderite."
Tadalak's face grew dour.
"Kerbeck got mad when I won it. Why, he accused me of cheating."
"Well, did you?"
Nima asked dryly.
"Huh,"
Tadalak said, then caught Nima's wry smile.
"No. But I was forced to hex his hands with a spell of betrayal once he got steamed. Well, he'd been on the stump hole liquor all day, so I had to do it."
What does that do?
"Well, every time he tried to hit me, his hands found himself instead."
After his mirth had died down, he surveyed the other two and asked,
"Where are you two going, by the way, and what are you looking for? There's been so much excitement since we met that I don't really know anything about you. Would you care to aid Tadalak in hunting devils?"
"We are, in fact, in the service of the Council of Lords of Savar, under Lord General Alexander of Bastos, to investigate that very thing."
Tadalak looked surprised at Bruckner's mention of General Alexander.
"I've met the general," he said. "A year or so ago, Tadalak helped stop some bandits who had stolen a shipment of medicine on its way from Bastos to Sivanar. The general gave me a commendation."
He smiled proudly.
"It's good news that he's leading the fight against these devils. Now I'm even gladder we met. I don't have much specific knowledge about these foes of ours, but I was on my way to a little settlement I know, just on the outskirts of the Skybreak Mountains. There are some people there who normally know what's going on in these parts. They're not the most..."
He paused a moment.
"Savory sorts, so Ox, you had better keep your sword handy. But some of them are half decent, and they're sure to know more than we do."
Nima listened with one ear, focusing the rest of her senses on locating spiders for her new pet to eat. Bruckner and Tadalak cleaned camp while the elf maid turned up a couple of jumping spiders and a nest of fat white grubs, which Canary ate with gusto. Tadalak turned to Bruckner as he shouldered his pack.
"It's north another 15 miles or so, past Skybreak, beneath Mount Ellispor. We should be able to get there by early evening."
"Let's be off then,"
Nima said, rising to her feet. The trio started out, again heading north. The day was cool and overcast. A bracing breeze was at their backs, bending the blades of grass and tugging at tree limbs. The 1,000 green fingers bent in the wind as if pointing the adventurers on their path. The raven leapt from Nima's shoulder and rode the gale forward, going so high that Nima could barely see her against the blue sea of sky. Tadalak kept pace fairly well with the others, though he often had to skip or jog in order to avoid falling too far behind. After 4 hours of brisk travel over hilly and sometimes wooded terrain, Tadalak was breathing a bit heavily. He plopped to the ground and took a comically long drink from his water skin.
Just 10 minutes?
He asked innocently. Bruckner stopped and nodded. He set his pack down and surveyed the area quickly, his right hand on the pommel of his sword. Nima pricked up her ears for any sounds of danger. They saw nothing that alarmed them, though Bruckner noticed a small herd of berserka, elegant creatures with long, delicate legs and velvet horns that sprouted into blooming buds of translucent white and yellow. The herd was grazing a quarter-mile to the southeast of their position, but they seemed to note Bruckner as well, for the animals, famously skittish and rarely seen in such large numbers in open daylight, began to move slowly but perceptibly away.
Teshibin, or berserker as they're called here.
Tadalak called joyously, pointing.
Yes, I've heard tell of them, but never seen one.
Strange to see them out during the day like this.
Something has been upset here.
Nima called out, rolling her prayer beads in her hand absently as she scanned the tree line.
Things are off kilter.
Aside from the herd of berserka, which soon disappeared over a fold in the land, and plenty of insects, birds, and small creeping things, the travelers saw nothing and no one. Possibly the scarcity of travelers was connected to the recent disturbances, though perhaps this barren stretch between Amenia and a group of largely uninhabited mountain ranges simply saw little foot and cart traffic anyway. Whatever the case, the three companions found themselves alone on the sloping plains below the Sky Mount peaks. The gray stone mountains loomed large across the northern horizon, and beyond them, its peaks still white with snow, they spied Mount Ellispor. As the three travelers rested and ate a brief repast, the sun emerged from behind its veil of cloud, and the wind slowed to a shallow stream. After a time, Tadalak jumped up off the thick clump of wild yellow grass he had been lying on.
Shall we be off?
They continued northward, coming upon more difficult paths. The undergrowth was tangled and profuse, and the group's pace slowed considerably. Soon, giant oaks were casting long shadows over the matted vegetation and thorny brambles. For a mile or so, they struggled along in this fashion, but the path grew yet more dense and the going more difficult. Tadalak finally threw up his hands after fighting his way through a thick briar patch, scrapes and scratches covering his hands and arms.
This is not a good path for gnomes and humans.
He quickly looked to Nima.
Nor half-elves either, I don't expect. What say we take to the road? We'll be to Thorn in another 2 miles or so, but I fear we'll get too badly tangled up if we keep going this way and won't make it before nightfall.
Very well. We should be clear enough of the city that we won't encounter mobs of rabble or bands of deserters.
Nima voiced her agreement, and the travelers extricated themselves from the tangled underbrush slowly, making their way west to the road. They came upon it at last, to their great relief. By now, the sun was lowering in the west. The air was full of the pregnant expectation of late afternoon, when slanted spears of yellow light glimmer with the dross of the day and dandelion spores float softly toward evening. Overjoyed at the feel of road underneath his feet again, Tadalak began skipping and cartwheeling. The gnome was quite acrobatic, doing small flips and handsprings with seeming ease. They made good time now, and within an hour, just as the sun was disappearing below the horizon, the companions came upon a small town, if such it could be called. They could see the whole of the small settlement from a ways off, which resembled something between a shanty town and a rural village. There were houses that appeared well built, though they were far from beautiful or inviting. Other dwellings and buildings were mere shacks, cobbled from scrap wood, logs, and sheets of tin and scrap metal, tied or hammered together with twine, nails, pine sap, and other such rudiments. Small fields lay around the edges of the town. Here and there, people were sowing rows of corn, wheat, or barley. In other stretches, hard-spun folk were planting root vegetables, some sparing a glance for the travelers as they approached. A boy with dark, serious eyes and a grime-streaked face worked silently alongside an older man, his father most like. The man was digging a furrow, guiding an ox-pulled plow for the boy to observe. The man's left hand was badly mangled, Bruckner noticed as they passed. A mass of red scar tissue sat where thumb and forefinger should have been. The man and his son looked up as the trio passed. The farmer spat stoically into the dirt and returned to his work. The boy's eyes lingered on Bruckner's sword, then snagged upon the swordman's gaze. A light seemed to glimmer in the deadened dark of the boy's eyes. Then some sneer twisted his lip, and he turned away as if angry, stomping toward the plow and demanding that he be allowed to try it himself. They surveyed the eclectic township as they passed through the gates. On the far side, they could just make out a large penned-in field of sheep who were baaing softly in the twilight, their bells clanking gently as they moved to and fro, grazing. In the very center of town was the most impressive building, a long, squat brick affair with no less than 4 chimneys puffing merrily. Tadalak tugged on Nima's cloak and the hem of Bruckner's tunic. They bent low to listen, for he spoke softly.
"You must both be on your guard here. Many of the people in Thorn are criminals and convicts who've moved here to be away from the law of the lords. That will make them reticent to cause trouble for outsiders in one way, but well, you know how bad people are. They cause trouble, especially when they've been drinking, as this lot always has. We should head to the tavern to seek out information, and for a drink or 3. I should tell you beforehand, though, these people know Tadalak a little. Sometimes I come here for information on the goings-on in these parts, because often bad people know what other bad people are up to. But I always act very, very silly around these people. Tadalak lets his natural silliness shine through here. It seems to make them less mad at me. Perhaps they don't think a silly, tiny gnome is a threat to them, so they listen to a few songs, laugh a lot, call me names, and then speak freely in front of me. So, when I start acting silly, it is not because I have forgotten my mission to serious myself, but because that is how they trust me here. Well, how they know me, at least, or is it how they forget I'm there?"
Tadalak paused in confusion, then seemed to find a way forward.
"In other words, or what I mean to say is, I don't know. These people make very little sense. They don't even know what they want. Huh. Whatever the case, shall we head in?"
Lead on.
Nima ran her fingers through her hair, making the best she could of it after a day of hard and tangled travel. Soon they were proceeding along a smaller dirt path towards the central street. Candles or cheap ensorcelled lights shone within several houses, but there were few people about. A tall man staggered past the group, leading a mule behind him, and Nima spied 2 figures sitting in semi-shadow by the door of a dark house, whispering in an unknown tongue. They paid the travelers no heed as they passed. Tadalak led them to the tavern. 2 broken lengths of rusted chain hung stiffly over the door, the sign they had once supported now leaning against the wall. Rudely carved letters with fading paint announced the place as the Og's Foot.
"Should be the Dog's Foot,"
Tadalak said mildly.
"Someone stole the D."
The door was ajar with several figures standing outside. 2 men were smoking pipes, a third was vomiting behind a water barrel. The 2 smokers looked up at the group suspiciously, then noticed Tadalak, who waved energetically. One of them, an ugly man with a matted thatch of greasy red hair, made a drunken conjecture about Tadalak's parentage as the other guffawed. Tadalak laughed heartily and hit back, suggesting that the man had best return to the sheep pen, as Tadalak could hear his wife bleating. The men laughed, breathed half-serious drunken oaths that they swiftly forgot, and turned back to their conversation. Bruckner, Nima, and Tadalak entered the tavern. It was gloomily lit, a small fire smoking in the central circular fireplace, and candles set on hooks jutting out from the support beams and walls. Old wooden tables were scattered throughout the room, and a long bar etched with endless scrawlings and knife marks extended along the wall. A wizened elf sat by the end of the bar, playing a sad melody on a lute. He did not sing. A burly fellow with a thick beard stood behind the counter, staring off into space with his right eye. His left eye was gone, nothing but a scarred and blackened pit remaining. The room was littered with figures here and there, sitting around tables in 2s and 3s. Bruckner and Nima each counted 7 figures in total, aside from the barkeep and the lute player. There was a heavily muscled dwarf with ringlets tied into his auburn beard, a giant tankard of mead in his hand. He was speaking quickly in Dwarvish to a smallish, hooded figure, whose face they could not see. Two middle-aged human men sat drinking together in silence in a corner. In the opposite corner sat an exotic-looking woman with dusky skin and a web of intricate facial tattoos snaking over her cheekbones. She wore a falchion on her back and a shoulder sheath. She did not appear to have touched the shank of lamb on the table before her, so busy was she conversing with two hooded figures. Bruckner thought the place had a dark feel to it, and a discomfiting lack of cheer.
Go ahead and settle in.
Tadalak said, setting his pack on the floor by a chair.
Keep an eye on my things, won't you? I'm going to the back and see if I can find Llewellyn.
And with that, the gnome headed to the back of the bar, waving gleefully at the barkeep and gesturing with his other hand at a rear door. The one-eyed proprietor signaled his assent dismissively. Tadalak had only just reached the handle, but he managed it. The other patrons, who had turned, nearly as one body, to examine the newcomers when they arrived, had largely lost interest, returning to their own troubles and tankards. Many of the patrons kept an eye turned that way, however, as Nima noted. She watched carefully, without seeming to watch. The barkeep, after nodding to Tadalak, surveyed Bruckner and Nima with a cold eye. Bruckner walked straight to the bar, affecting a jovial attitude as if ignorant of the interest their arrival had generated. He pulled a gold dazrin from his coin purse and placed it before the proprietor.
3 good meals, sir, with roast meat, please, and 3 flagons of ale.
Where you lot in from? He asked gruffly. Many of the people in the bar were still staring. Bruckner noted the woman with the falchion in particular, studying both he and Nima. The muscular dwarf was jawing on loudly, indifferent to the changes about him. Bruckner responded in a tone of cheerful neutrality.
We're travelers, friends of Tadalak. I'm from Cormorant by origin, but now I live on the road. Spent some time in Amenia, but it seems they're having some troubles now, so we're on the road again.
Friends of that little walking mouth, huh? Surprised anyone can stand him long enough to call him that. Well, no difference.
The man slid the coin into his hand and counted out Bruckner's change, a grubby silver disc and a few copper bits.
Food'll be out in a few minutes. My boy'll bring your ales directly, though. Sit where you like.
Bruckner nodded in thanks and turned to go back to his seat.
Hey. We're a quiet group of folk here. Here, we mind ourselves and appreciate guests doing the same. Don't be looking to make no trouble with that pretty blade of yours.
Oh, no doubt. I'm with you there. We'll just have a bite to eat and be passing on, thank you.
Nima sat quietly, straining her keen ears to hear what she could of the discussions among the patrons. She watched the woman with the curved blade and her companions. Just then the woman looked up and their eyes met. The woman made a swift hand motion and began speaking over her companion. Nima caught a few words. As best she could make out, they were discussing the price of a plot of land in the region. Bruckner returned to the table that Nima and Tadalak had chosen, the nearest to the door, and took up a seat with his back to the wall. He settled into a wary rest, keeping an eye on all that transpired. Almost at once, a small boy, certainly no more than 6 or 7, struggling under the weight of 3 foaming tankards, made his way to the table, setting the tray down with a heavy thunk. Into the boy's hand, Bruckner slipped the silver piece and the coppers the barkeep had given him. He seemed startled, and though his eyes lit up briefly, his look quickly turned to one of nervousness, his eyes darting back to the bar. The owner's back was turned, however. The boy flashed Bruckner an anxious smile, his eyes both thanking and pleading, and slipped the coins into his shoe. He hurried off. 10 minutes passed, and the boy returned, bearing one massive plate at a time. Roast lamb shanks, sweet potatoes, and mashed peas covered the platters. Nima and Bruckner were relieved to see that, despite the gloomy and humble air of the place, the food appeared edible. Bruckner sniffed his beer and food cautiously, then shrugged and began to eat. Nima ate as well, occasionally feeding scraps to her raven. The meal now underway, Tadalak emerged from the back room with a gigantic half-orc in tow. He appeared to be in the middle of some humorous anecdote because the giant half-orc was laughing uproariously, a rather alarming sound. Tadalak hopped onto the chair next to Nima's and said,
This is Llewellyn. He lives around these parts and was kind enough to sell me a pony and 2 horses, one for each of you.
He turned to Nima and said,
Horses are faster than people, you know.
With a knowing smile that seemed to say, keep it under your hat. Tadalak tried to heft the roast lamb shank from his plate. When he was unable to get a good grip on it, he simply laughed and lowered his face to it, tearing off a tiny bite. Then he sat back stoically to tip a little bit of ale into his mouth. Llewellyn finally wore out his mirth and said loudly,
So this little mongrel tells me you're on the trail of that yellow-bellied king who went missing, eh?
At the question about King Janison, Bruckner noticed the exotic woman's eyes dart over to their table. Nima was considering the half-orc. She doubted that his intentions were altogether honest. He was obviously somewhat drunk, and she could sense tension in his voice. She could not say, however, if this stemmed from some personal interest in the king, or simply because this was a belligerent and savage humanoid who had over-imbibed. Bruckner called out with studied joviality to the barkeep.
Another drink, sir, for my friend.
Straight away the boy emerged again, carrying another large tankard of ale which he set quickly on the table before scampering back. Llewellyn laughed heartily, seeming to ease up, and picked up the tankard with gusto.
Thank you, lad.
He called, tipping the mug back and draining perhaps half of the ale in one go. He belched loudly, setting it back down with a thunk.
It's a real treat to meet youth with manners these days. Tallack, you keep good company.
Bruckner gestured for one more. It was fast and emerging.
Nothing like good ale. Never trust the one who won't drink.
And then, turning to Tattalack, Bruckner quietly asked,
Tattalack, old man, will we be staying here tonight in this excellent company? Or had we better be on our way?